right. Good evening to each of you. We're continuing our study through the book of Revelation. Just as a reminder of where we are, remember chapter 1 through 3, we introduce Jesus in an exalted state. He begins with judgment of the churches. So, starting in chapter 4, we move to the exalted scene of God in heaven sitting on his throne. And we spend the whole chapter looking at that, exalting him. And then we have the mirror of that, if you will, in chapter 5, where Jesus is exalted. And in between those two, we have this great scroll that God's holding out and that only Jesus can take, and that only he can open the seals of this seven-sealed scroll. So that's where we pick up tonight, is the actual unleashing or the opening of the scrolls on this. And as we see these seals being opened, we're going to see these four horsemen come out. And this is, of course, the four horsemen that people think of in popular movies and comics, wherever. This is actually the source of where this that symbol in Americana comes from. All right, so beginning here in chapter 6, John says, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, 'Come and see.' Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, 'Come and see.' So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine.' When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, 'Come and see.' So I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beast of the earth." All right, so this begins our opening of the seven seals. You're going to see a pattern in the seven seals. We're going to have these 4, we're going to have a break, and then we're going to have the other 3. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the 7 trumpets. It's going to be 4, interlude 3, and then we're going to have 7 vials or bowls of wrath at the very end of the book. And again, 4, interlude 3. So we're going to see a lot of similarity as we look at these. And that's going to be a talking point and something for us to think about. How are these things similar and how are they different as we go through the book? But for right now, let's just focus on these 4 horsemen. Who are they? What do they represent? We do have some help, because this is something that there's some basis for in the book of Zechariah, specifically chapter 1 and chapter 6. So, assuming you looked at this, how are the images of the horsemen similar, but yet maybe different from what we have in the book of Zechariah? And then how can we use that to figure out what this means? So let's just start. How does this compare to the book of Zechariah? We'll just start with that question.
In both cases, they have similar colors associated with them. And then also, images in Zechariah several times that they patrol the earth, or that they go around the earth and stuff. And that's kind of like the picture we get here with some of these, is that they're going around the world doing certain things.
Yep. Essentially, they're agents of God that he is using, sending out to accomplish the work that he would have them to do. All right, any clues you got from Zechariah as far as what their work might be?
To patrol the earth and monitor it.
Just to monitor it?
To carry out God's will in different ways sometimes.
All right, specifically what kind of ways?
It talks a lot about peace. So chapter 1 and chapter 6. In chapter 1 it says that we have walked to and fro throughout the earth, and behold, all the earth is resting quietly. And in chapter 6, he called to me and spoke to me, saying, "See, those who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country."
All right, very good. So all these answers are right, but I think what Andrew's bringing out is a really key takeaway for us. They're not just patrolling. And they're not just looking, they're also agents that are involved with, concerned with, and reestablishing peace. They are providing peace to God. Now, why would God be upset about something? Something is bothering his character, what we know about God. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. So just a chart here to kind of break this down. Again, I hope that you read this. We're not going to be able to read these passages, but it helps tremendously to read those to fully understand this. But in chapter 1, we have the 3 different colors. So red, sorrel, which is kind of a reddish brown, and white. And we find them resting, and they're reporting that the earth is at rest. And again, they say that God has sent them. So that's, as Andrew said, that is their concern. When we get to chapter 6, we see that they're coming out, but they're actually pulling chariots. And there's 4 of them this time. So again, we see something we've talked about before, where we see the same kind of elements of a vision being reused, but it's not the exact same. But that doesn't mean that we just throw everything out and start all over. We still take what we learned from the previous versions, previous visions, what those elements mean, and use them appropriately. So here we see them coming out from between 2 bronze mountains. If we think of bronze as being something that is itself polished and refined, and then also something that is very fiery looking, and then also something that is very hard and used for as an instrument of judgment, and the fact that we have 2 of these. So go back to 2, we think about the 2 or 3 witnesses by which someone is condemned. So we have this judgment, if you will, proceeding from a well-qualified witness of judgment against them. So what are they doing? We have the red, black, and white. So in this case, we actually have 4 very similar colors to what's in Revelation 6. We have the dapple, which is the spotted gray, and that's about the only difference there. Again, 4 spirits proceeding from God. Again, like chapter 1, walking to and fro, going throughout the earth. And here we have God's commentary that the ones that are, and they're going in the different directions, the ones that go to the north provide rest to his spirit. Now, in Zechariah, the north is associated with Babylon, and the whole point of the message of the whole book really is to encourage Israelites, Jews, to come out of Babylon, to rebuild the temple, to reestablish God's city in Jerusalem, and to encourage them that they are part of something much bigger. They're not just building an earthly temple, they're part of something that's actually building up a spiritual temple. And so, anyway, in chapter 2, he's encouraging them to come out of the north, to touch no unclean thing, and that he's going to help them rebuild. And here in chapter 6, we see these going to the north, and they're doing something that's providing peace. And the problem that God has at this point is that Babylon has mistreated his people. They are unjust, and they are in need of judgment. So we see the white horse going to the north, indicating that war and conquering is coming to Babylon. All right, so just a quick reminder, think about Deuteronomy 32:35, and then quote it in Hebrews 10:30. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. God is very concerned about people that are doing wrong not getting away with it. Injustice has to be taken care of. And so we see these horses and the chariots being agents of God's vengeance in the book of Zechariah. Now, if we take that and we compare it to Revelation 6, we have differences. These things are not coming from a mountain, but they're unleashed by opening a seal, and they're introduced by different living creatures. But there's similarity in the colors and the horses, but there is some elaboration for each of these. So the first one, the white horse, has got a bow, and he's given a crown. By the way, this is a Stephanos, so this is a victory crown. This is not a diadem. This is not something that belongs to a king or royalty. This is somebody who is a winner. He's going and achieving victory. And this is his purpose, to go out to conquer. And then we have the fiery red horse, who's taking peace from the earth and then turning people against each other. He's causing people to kill each other, and he's given a great sword, so that's indicative of the fact that he's going to be very effective, and a lot of people are going to be killed. The black horse, we're told that he has a pair of scales in his hand, and the comment says that the foods that are the most common would actually increase in price. However, the luxurious foods are not going to increase in price. So we have a question. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. So I'll withhold comment for now. And then we have the pale horse. We're told that the one who sat on him was death, and the Hades, or the grave, or Sheol followed him, and power was given over them to kill a fourth of the earth. And we're told specifically they would use sword, hunger, death, and the beast of the earth. All right, so what does this mean? I think just like in Zechariah, these are agents of God's vengeance, and they're sent to reckon and bring judgment against the people that are oppressing God's people, and then ultimately bring rest to his spirit, if you will, to bring peace, to set him at ease. So the first horse, I believe, represents military conquests. This would be, if we're thinking about this coming at Rome, this would be outside invaders chipping away at Rome's empire and weakening it and conquering pieces of it. The red horse would represent internal strife, treachery, people turning on each other. This is a common theme that we see throughout scriptures. This is a common tool that God uses to restore justice. So if you're familiar with the story of Abimelech, the judge, who took over, usurped, and became a judge, made himself a judge in Judges 9, 7 through 24. He killed all of the sons just about of the preceding judge. Or was it, I just went blank. I want to call him Jerubbabel, but that's not right. It's Gideon, I believe. But anyway, he killed all of his sons except for one, Jotham. And then Jotham says this parable, and the conclusion of the parable is that fire is going to come out of Abimelech and devour the people that betrayed these sons and turned against them. And then we're told that God sent a spirit of ill will and took Abimelech and these other people, and basically the people that had been allies to make Abimelech judge, they turned on each other and started killing each other. Zechariah 8:10 through 17, as well as in 14:13, there's similar references to God saying that he previously, just like he brought famine, just like he brought these wild animals to come in and disrupt society, he also turned people against each other. So again, this is a common tool. And then I think we also have a clue to this again back in Daniel 2 with the iron and clay. There's going to be pieces of this kingdom that's not going to adhere to itself, and it's going to be easy to divide. And that's going to be a big part of its downfall. All right, so the third one, the black horse, this is going to represent some kind of economic disaster. Obviously, he's emphasizing food and having limited amounts. This is, again, something that God foretold even for his own people in Leviticus 26 as well as Lamentations 5. He talks about it happening, where they would, because of the sieges and because of the lack of food and also because of famine, not just sieges, people would have to ration the food, and at some point they would even start eating their own children because they would be so desperate for food. That would be the severity that would happen. And so that was foretold all the way back in Leviticus and Ezekiel 4, as well as famines earlier, even in the divided king in 2 Kings 6:25, we see those things happening. Ezekiel 4 is there God uses, Ezekiel cuts his hair into 3 pieces, and then like a third of it he burns, and a third he gives to the sword. And anyway, so he uses this to represent how that God would take some portion of the people and would destroy them in certain ways, and only a remnant would be left over. But in there he talks about how in the destruction of Jerusalem there would be many who would go without food, and the dire circumstances would lead them to do the unthinkable. All right, and then the fourth one is as we mentioned, this is kind of other factors coming in, killing people, whether this is pestilence or raiders or wild animal, beast of the earth. There's a lot of different possibilities. This, in addition to the symbols from Zechariah, the judgment itself is very similar to judgments that God gave in Ezekiel 5 as well as 14. And at the end of 14, he calls them his 4 severe judgments. So we have the 4 severe judgments and we have the 4 horsemen. These same things being pictured, symbolized to us, but it's essentially the exact same judgments. If you look at Ezekiel 14, it is the exact same judgments, except for he brings up pestilence, so he brings up sickness, plagues, and that's not one of the ones that's mentioned here. So that's a minor difference, but otherwise very similar, and very similar kind of references. All right, so any questions about that? What do you think? It's a lot to absorb. All right. So let's talk a little bit more detail about each of these. So who do you think the rider on the white horse is? And whatever you think, how does it fit in with the chronology that we've seen and established so far from chapters 1 through 5? Especially 1, 4, and 5.
Didn't we mention that it might be Alexander the Great?
So Alexander the Great is mentioned in Daniel 8 when there's this beast, this empire that arises, and there's one horn in the front of it that comes from the whole side, from the west to the east, conquering the world. It looks an awful lot like Alexander the Great. Just it fits very closely to the history. But if this is talking about, think about the chronology of where we were in chapter 4 and 5. 4, remember, Jesus is missing. 5, he's there and he's taking the scroll and he's unleashing it. So if this is parallel to what we were looking at earlier in Daniel 7, where we're in the 4th kingdom, then we're past Alexander the Great. And so he's already come and gone. This would be something actually happening to Rome.
It reminds me of Mongols.
Rome would suffer from lots of different kinds of invaders. One of the ones that actually comes up quite a bit is the Parthians, because actually they use archery. And so that was one of the things that kind of, and also the direction that they were coming from, kind of leads some people to think that. But Rome would suffer from lots of different invaders as well. Ultimately, the Germanic hordes coming in would be one of the big pieces of their downfall. But like you've heard, Rome wasn't built in a day. It wasn't destroyed in a day either. And there was no silver bullet. There was lots of different elements. And that fits with what we're looking at too, right? This is not one horse coming in and taking them out. They're being chipped away little by these different elements. So a lot of times people will say, well, that's got to be Jesus. Because here he is, he's in white, and he's going, and he's conquering. And so oftentimes the view, like Haley takes the position that, I think I mentioned this to you last time, that in chapter 5, the scroll is the gospel plan of salvation, and that this is Jesus going and conquering in the church. So there's a lot to be said for that view. There's verses that you could use and arguments you could make, but I think there's things that make it fit better by saying, no, this is one of the agents that are being brought to bear by God on Rome. So, reasons for this. It's kind of weird if Jesus is the one opening the symbols and the coming out of the first symbol is himself. Even for a symbolic book, that's kind of weird. That doesn't necessarily clinch it, but it is a bit weird. So we do see Jesus on a white horse later, but his saints are also on a white horse. And then, as I said earlier, this rider has given us Stephanos, not a diadem. And so that is also odd, because you would expect Jesus to be wearing the diadems as well. To me, the most compelling thing, actually I think I have a little bit more here. So this rider has a bow. Jesus, when we see him later, he has a different instrument. He has a sword. And remember, that's the way we've generally seen him up to this point, is he has a sword that comes from his mouth with which he strikes the nations. So even though God is spoken of as having a bow in some cases in the Old Testament, this would be unusual to see Jesus with the bow. To me, the most compelling thing is it would be kind of an anachronism. We would be like messing up the timeline of Revelation of what we've seen so far, with chapter 5 being Jesus returning to the throne, returning to heaven, being coronated, and then been giving all authority and then unleashing judgment, that it would be kind of weird that we're now kind of stepping back and saying, okay, now we've had a flashback, let's have yet another flashback and interrupt our flashback with a flashback. It makes it much harder to understand. And I think the other thing is I'll go back to this, I think Zechariah is also the most compelling, because oftentimes when we see the rider on the white horse, we're like, that has got to be Jesus. Who else could it be? Well, if you go to Zechariah, we see riders on white horses who are going out to conquer, and they are not Jesus. They are some army that's coming in and actually destroying Babylon. So Medo-Persian in that case. So just because it's a rider on a white horse doesn't mean that it has to be Jesus. We have precedents from the Old Testament for it being other people. All right. Other thoughts, questions? All right. So let's go on to the third question, which is about the third seal, actually. So he's got this unusual comment for this one seal. After the black horse, his weapon is a pair of scales. So think like a marketplace, right? And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. So the oil and wine would be the food of the rich. That's the luxurious foods. But wheat, barley, that's your basic elements for bread and basic grains, and they're going up significantly. So what's the point of this? Who is this hurting?
The common people.
Yeah, it's hurting the common people. So in a society, if it's the common people who start struggling for food, and the rich people are just doing just fine, it's not affecting them at all, what other impacts is that going to have on society?
Like riot or anarchy.
Yes. So it's going to stir up a kind of a class warfare, if you will, turning the poor against the rich, and create even more division and more instability in the society. So this is the wheat and barley. This is the staples of the common people. The oil and wine would have only been afforded by the wealthy. And so this would basically, whatever class divide was there, which was already severe because most of their empire was built on the backs of slavery. So hitting this even more so would even further this and deepen this divide, destabilizing the country even more. All right, so let's talk about the fifth seal now. So when he opened the fifth seal, notice this is completely different from the other four. I saw under the altar the souls of those who have been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. So what do you think is the significance of these souls being under the altar? I mean, is it covering them up? Is it hiding them? I mean, is he trying to minimize these people who are under the altar?
I think of the Old Testament when the sacrifices were done, the blood was poured at the base of the altar and was kept there. It could have been people like Paul who thought they were actually making sacrifices for God. They were doing things good for God, persecuting the saints, something like that maybe.
Okay, all right. I do think there is a very close association with Paul, but we'll get back to that. So, like Caleb mentioned, so the sacrifices, there would be certain elements of some things would be burned, put blood on this person's ear, on this toe, on the horns of the altar, maybe sprinkle a little bit, but the rest of the blood was actually just poured at the base of the altar. So you can imagine just sacrifice after sacrifice, if they're sacrificing cows and large animals, it wouldn't take too long and there would be a tremendous amount of blood just all over the altar, but just around it, just making a moat of sorts. And so it would have been a very moving scene to see all of that blood. And this seems to be what this is hearkening back to, is again, we have an altar but we don't see blood, we see these souls under the altar. So I think I have several passages here for you from Exodus as well as Leviticus. The ones from Leviticus 17:11 talks about the life being in the blood, and so that's why you're not allowed to eat the blood, is because it represents the person's life. So as we think about the blood being under the altar, it's a pretty easy step to say, okay, this represents the people being poured out around the altar. And so this is not too far of a stretch to also see this here in this case. Is these are people that have sacrificed their lives for Christ, for God, and we're seeing this symbolized by them being kind of poured out as blood all around the altar. So, so I think this represents all of these martyrs who had sacrificed their lives, sacrificed their blood, as he says here, under the altar, slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. They just didn't die. They actually died because they were Christians. So this is where we really start to come to one of the key passages and kind of pivotal moments in the book of Revelation that we see kind of one of the main driving factors. Again, why is God's Spirit not at rest? As in the words of Zechariah 6. So we see these people here. Later he's going to talk about in 24 that these souls are those who've actually been beheaded as well. So this actually makes Paul's language when he says that I am ready to be poured out as a drink offering all that more graphic, because he would have been beheaded and all of his blood would have come out almost immediately. And so it makes the drink offerings of the Old Testament have a lot more meaning. That is a reference to something that is being completely emptied and completely used up, and there's nothing left. And so that it's just a sobering thought just to even think about that having to happen to Paul as well as to all of these other people. And here we see this symbol that references everything that they sacrificed, their very lives, in a very brutal and very sudden way that they did for Christ. All right. I want to talk about their complaint next, but any thoughts or comments before we leave question 4? All right, so these that are under the altar, what is their concern? What's their complaint that they have? They've not been avenged. Again, this ties right back into everything we were looking at Zechariah with these 4 horsemen. They want to know how long. God, holy, just, and true, before you avenge. So, what can we learn about God's nature and his judgment based on how he reacts to them?
That God wasn't caught off guard by this. There was never any moment of time where man was beating God in any way. He always had a plan. It was always going to happen.
Yes, this is a rich text. There's a lot of things we need to get from this. So one of the ones we need to get is God's not surprised. This is something that he knew. He was on top of it. They weren't bringing anything to his attention. So seeing God that he's composed and in control, go back to chapter 4, still sitting on his throne, that's important to see. What else?
I think it's comforting that God cares about that. He doesn't say that this is like an unreasonable thing that you should want to be avenged. He says, "Oh, it's gonna happen. I'm working on it," basically.
Yep. So moving from that to the fact that he's concerned about this is something that he wants to take care of. This is not something that he's insensitive to. I think the other thing is you see him being compassionate also in this response. And again, this is something we see throughout Scripture. Think about how God responded to Elijah when he was completely give up. And think about John the Baptist in the prison and how Jesus reacted to him. In all of these cases where we see God's people just completely wore out, at just the edge of giving up and them saying, God, are you going to do something about this? I'm not saying that he wouldn't at some point, lose his patience, but we often see him being very compassionate and very understanding, which I think tells us a lot about God. And that should be a very comforting and reassuring thought to us that, again, he's sympathetic to our weaknesses and knows how we feel, and we have such a high priest, but we also have a father that wants to give good gifts to his children. So all of this I think we can learn from this. So specifically 6:10 through 11 here, how long, O Lord, holy and true? Notice they're calling on his very nature, just like Elijah when he calls out God he calls him the Lord of hosts, or of Sabaoth. He's saying, you've got armies. Why don't you do something about this? In the same way here, as they're calling God out by name, they're emphasizing the characteristics of God that they think should compel him to act. O Lord, holy and true, until you judge, how long until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed. All right, so what else do we see here?
There's still more to come. He acknowledges what they're asking, and he gives them their white robe, but there's still more that have to die, even in the same way that they did.
Yeah. So, God is someone who is always accomplishing multiple things in a single action. So it's always a mistake to look at something God does and say, oh, this is the thing that he's doing. No, he's probably doing several other things too. So don't make too much out of it. But there's several other passages that I think are very important for us to think about. So very quickly, let me narrate these that I have here for you. They're slightly off topic. So we have several passages. Think about going back to Genesis 4 with, remember, the blood of Abel crying forth from the grounds, and that the land has absorbed this. And then also going into Numbers 35, 33, the land being defiled by blood that's shed. And then Job, I have 16, 18, Isaiah 26, 21, and then Hebrews 24, 7 to 8, all talk about blood that has been unjustly shed and that it's defiled the ground, and people are trying to cover it up. They're trying to put dirt on top of it to cover up the fact they don't want God to see the blood that they've shed on the ground, and the ground is a witness to that. Or God making sure that it's going to be set up on a rock where it cannot be covered up. And then Hebrews 11:4 and then 12:24 talks about Abel being dead still speaking, and Christ's blood speaking of better things than what Abel's blood spoke. The idea is a very similar picture, that even though these people are dead, they're still talking, and it is their blood that is still actually speaking to us and has a message for us to consider. And so there's precedence for this kind of symbolism already for other points. But so all of these passages show that God is deeply concerned about this and wants to avenge this and wants to make this right on one hand. But on the other hand, God doesn't want anybody to be lost. He wants everybody to be saved. So 2 Peter 3:9, right? Ezekiel 18 as well as Ezekiel 33 talks about God having no pleasure in the death of even a wicked man. Repent, turn and live, get yourself a new heart. So he wants to bring judgment on those that are wicked, but he doesn't want to destroy the wicked because he wants to save them. And so then this creates the challenge that has to be dealt with. And the answer often is time. So God is patient in how he deals with the people that are wicked and in the people that exist in those places in various states of maturity, but his patience has limits. And I think this is one of the key takeaways for both understanding Revelation as well as how we see God acting with other nations throughout Scripture. So 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 16 talks about God rising up early, getting up early, something he really wanted to do, and sending his prophets just over and over again to his people, but the people kept turning away, and eventually there was no remedy. No amount of time, no amount of prophets, nothing could be done. Go back to Isaiah, Isaiah 6, where he talks about his vineyard. What more could I have done? There is nothing more that could be done. There was no more remedy, and so judgment had to happen. In Genesis 15:16, there's a very insightful phrase where he's talking to Abraham, where he's telling him what's going to happen to the Israelites. They're going to go down into Egypt. They're going to be into bondage up until the 4th generation. And then they'll come out because the sin of the Amorites is not yet full. So the Amorites weren't as wicked as they were going to get. And it would be premature to bring the Israelites out as an instrument of judgment in taking out the Amorites at this point. More time was needed. And so part of one of the things that was happening while the Israelites were in Egypt is the nations in Canaan were getting more time. They were having more opportunity, more chances to straighten things up before the Israelites were brought in as a tool of judgment in cleaning up the land. Let's see. I'm going to pass over these other ones for now, but what we see in all these cases is there comes a point in time where eventually God uses messengers, he uses his message, he uses time, he uses various other providential circumstances, but eventually time runs out. And so I'd like to suggest to you this is the challenge that we're seeing actually all throughout the book of Revelation. Why doesn't God just come in and just take them all out and just make this right all at once? Because there was a lot of people in Rome. So go back to the story of Jonah. There's a lot of people there who don't know their right hand from their left. And so God doesn't want to just come in and wipe them out because he's still trying to pull people out. And you have a clue right here in this text. Who's he waiting on? What's the clock?
More servants.
Yeah. There's more people that have to die. There's more Christians that have to come into the kingdom. The number is not there yet. And so God has certain people that he knows that he's waiting on. There's some, again, he's looking for the amount of people he can save out of this empire before he shuts the lights out. And it's not time yet. So in the meantime, they're reassured that they have a reward, and they are told that it would be a little while longer. So a couple things. One, he's not waiting forever. Again, patience has its limits. But going back to the struggle of how do we interpret this book again? Again, here's another clue that says this is not something that's far off in the future. It's not something that's dealing with the end of the world, which still hasn't happened 2,000 years later. This was something that was just a little while longer. So it puts the application very close by to them. So I think this is also helpful for us to understand. Think about our own country. Is there going to come a time where he's going to call accounts due? I mean, what are the sins of America? One of the things that comes to mind immediately is all the abortions. I mean, we're talking about blood. I mean, just millions and millions of innocent lives shed for the most hedonistic reasons. Will there come a time where he calls due? Yes, he will. When is that going to happen? I have no idea. None of us are going to know. But I know this, I don't think it will happen as long as there's people here that are trying to make a difference, and there are people that a difference can be made on them. As long as there's more souls to pull out, then I don't think he's going to call it due. But that's just my estimation of what we have here. So something for us to think about, something for us to be busy doing, making sure that we're concerned about this work and diligent in it. All right, any questions about that before we get to the sixth seal? All right, so now we have something that looks pretty catastrophic. I looked, when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, notice all these things here that I've got enumerated for you. A great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind. The sky receded as a scroll. The mountain and islands were moved out of their places. Kings of the earth, everybody is terrified, hiding themselves, asking the mountains and rocks to fall on them to save them from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Boy, if this isn't the end of the world, I don't know what is. Is this the end of the world?
I mean, if it was actually like literal, then the stars would, being bigger than the earth, would have just like swallowed the earth in fire. So, and the people that speak up in the next few verses would not be alive.
Correct. Yeah. So there are some problems in trying to interpret this literally.
The same language used in Isaiah 13 about the fall of Babylon, destruction of mighty nations, and for them it would be the end of their world and everything they knew.
All right. Good. Good. So I think you all have touched on the key points, but I'm not just going to skip through this question. We'll start next time. I'll go ahead and show you what I have here in the slides, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and then we'll wrap up this chapter and get into chapter 7. So thank you all. Appreciate your time and your participation and your preparation. I'll see you next time.